Welcome to Unchatted Waters. In this episode, we dip our ears into the ocean and listen to the magical soundscape beneath the waves. We discuss what we can hear underwater from Earth, animals and humans that contribute to the instruments, players and composition of a symphony. So submerge yourself in this episode as we open your ears to the magic of the ocean's orchestra. And 1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Unchatted Waters, the podcast that talks to the people behind the science. I'm Kirsty, your host. I'm excited to introduce my two guests for this episode. Nathan Merchant is a principal scientist in noise and bioacoustics. He advises national and overseas governments on how to reduce noise pollution across the world's oceans. Rosalind Putland is a senior scientist specialising in recording underwater sound in freshwater and marine environments to help investigate the effect of human noise on aquatic animals. Welcome to the podcast, both.
Hi.
Thank you.
I'm excited for this episode. I think it's going to be really interesting. So my first question is going to be, what sounds can we hear in the ocean?
Let's dive straight into it. So sounds come from many different sources in the ocean. We normally think of it as quite a pristine environment with sounds from geological and natural sources such as the rain, waves, wind, earthquakes. But there's also bioacoustics, which was in our description at the beginning, and that is the biological sounds produced by animals in our waters. So things like marine mammals, whales, dolphins and seals, fishes, as well as invertebrates too, which often people forget about. So lobsters, crabs, snapping shrimp, all those fun things. But more recently, humans have introduced sounds into the ocean, which we generalise as underwater ocean noise. So the combination of all these things, geological sounds, bioacoustics or biological sounds, and human noise is referred to as the soundscape, or kind of like the seascape of sound underwater.
Wow, that sounds really poetic, the soundscape, seascape. So what does a soundscape actually sound like, Nathan?
Well, I don't know if our listeners have ever had the experience of putting their heads under the surface of the ocean. I certainly have. You can hear waves and so on, but actually our ears are not very well adapted to listening underwater. So for quite a long time, it was assumed that the underwater soundscape is actually pretty quiet. In fact, Jacques Cousteau's famous film from the 1950s was called The Silent World, which speaks volumes about how much noise was understood to be under there. But actually sound travels underwater really well. Our ears are not adapted, we're adapted to hear in air for understandable reasons. Sound travels much faster underwater. So in air, sound travels about 340 meters a second, but it's more like 1,500 meters a second underwater. And it also travels much further. So sound can travel across entire ocean basins. And in fact, baleen whale species have evolved to communicate over really vast distances that we couldn't really imagine. The way that they do that, just as a sidebar while we're on the topic, there's this, what's called the SOFAR channel underwater, which is a minimum in the sound speed profile, which sounds very technical, but basically what happens is about 1 kilometer below the surface of the water in the deep ocean, sound is focused at this level. So baleen whales or indeed submarines are at depth. You can actually hear sounds from a very long distance away.
Is it like a sound magnifying glass almost that amplifies that sound, or is it just, can you describe a bit more of how it works?
I guess it's almost like a secret tunnel. The sound travels through, or maybe like a megaphone, it kind of focuses the sound along this channel. So instead of the sound bouncing off the surface of the sea or in the bottom of the sea and losing energy, what happens is the sound waves are kind of curved back into this SOFAR channel so they don't lose energy and they actually travel thousands of kilometers.
So is that just the different layers of the ocean that are creating
exactly,
the ocean
yes.
that we think about oceanography? Is it?
So it's to do with the oceanography. So the sound speed varies with a number of different parameters. It varies with depth, temperature, with salinity, and the way these factors interact with depth means that there's this minimum in the sound speed profile.
It's hard to describe
without a diagram and so on. It's a bit difficult to explain, but yes, it's this shape of the sound speed profile means that sound is focused at this particular depth.
Maybe we can add the diagram to the infographic for this episode on our website to help us visualise that. But it's amazing that there's a secret magnifying tunnel at the bottom of the ocean. So Nathan mentioned that human ears are adapted to listen in air and not underwater. So how do we actually listen to sounds in the ocean?
As scientists, we need to go out and record the sounds that we're interested in listening for. And we use a device called a hydrophone, or an underwater microphone. And this device can range in size. It can be really, really small to quite large devices as well. But most importantly, it's more sensitive than the human ear because it can record frequencies that we can't. So generally, most humans can hear between about 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz, whereas these hydrophones can record sometimes lower and sometimes higher than this range. And so scientists all around the globe are using hydrophones in freshwater and marine environments to record the sounds that they're interested in. So listening in real time, so a live recording where you're able to put on headphones when you're on a boat and listen to what's around you, whether it's dolphins that are off of your back deck.
I can visualise that, scientists with like headphones on, a bit like a metal detector, just with a hydrophone over the side and just listening to what's around them.
Yeah, and that can
Listening
be really
live to the
exciting.
ocean sounds cool.
Listening into the conversations of all the things that are going on around you. Or we could also put things out for a long time as well. So we deploy hydrophones on the bottom of the ocean in order to record and then listen back to those later once we go back and collect those devices, maybe many months later.
Wow. So when you talked about freshwater, listening to what happens in freshwater, what kind of things might we hear in freshwater? Because I think today we're going to focus on the ocean. It might be interesting to hear about what you might hear in freshwater environments.
Yeah, in freshwater environments, there's lots of fish species that can maybe produce sounds. Bass, some trout and salmon may actually even produce some sounds when they're migrating up and down river. Some invertebrate species, so some freshwater shrimp, so kind of clicking sounds. But we also have a lot of the human noise that we're used to in the oceans. So boats, fishing, and even when rivers and lakes freeze over, they can produce the sound of ice cracking, as well as when humans go out and they'll maybe use an ice auger to drill through the ice. That's really loud, and you can hear the sort of crunching of people walking around on the ice. So
Ice
all those
skating and
fish below can hear what's going on above.
So can we also hear movement of water, across pebbles in shallow brooks and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the movement of pebbles and rocks on the bottom.
So it's an orchestra in both the ocean and in freshwater environments.
Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. Loads of different players, loads of different instruments. So Nathan, Roz has described how we listen to things in the water, both in the ocean and freshwater environments. When did we start listening?
Well, perhaps Jacques Cousteau did not read his Pliny the Younger or Elder, I forget which one. In the ancient text, there's definitely a record that, of hearing sounds underwater. Leonardo da Vinci also noted that I think boats could be heard at a distance underwater. But really, this, like many things technologically and scientifically, it was the world wars which really increased the interest in underwater sound. So suddenly we had submarine warfare in particular. There was interest in being able to detect ships at a distance and being able to detect submarines. That's really when the science of underwater sound really developed. A lot of the kind of science that we've inherited, at least in the early days, has come out of that. It's also been a great help in many ways, because one of the things that came out during the Cold War was certain countries wanting to set up listening stations for submarines. These were archival recordings, and those still exist. So we're actually able to compare the soundscape in the 1950s with how it is today. These are mainly recordings from America in the Northeast Pacific. Those really show how, over the decades, shipping noise in particular has increased. Out of this history of kind of military applications, we're actually able to understand some of the environmental consequences of human activities in terms of noise.
Brilliant. And it's interesting to know that in the ancient scripts, there was records of noise underwater. So from the very beginnings of time, there were curious people like us putting their heads in the sea, which is always nice to remember. So we're not alone. So I think it's time for us to listen to a couple of sounds. So listeners, if you wanted to put some headphones on for this bit, you'll be able to hear the sounds in much better quality. And we're going to do the same. We're going to have a listen to these sounds. So let's get started with some non-biological sounds. rain. It also sounds like boiling lava. Should we listen to that again?
So in the middle, you should be listening for a low rumble. And this is an earthquake that was recorded a couple 100 kilometers away from where the hydrophone was located. You hear it really, really far because the speed of sound through soil or ground, bedrock, is faster than through water. So even faster than it is through air.
Wow, really? It's too early for a fun fact, but that's really interesting though. It goes faster through rock than through air and water.
Yeah, so it can help in kind of early warning systems for tsunamis and so on, because that sound is going to arrive before any wave might arrive.
So are there any other non-biological sounds that you can describe?
In polar regions where we have a lot of ice melting, this creates a lot of sound. It's actually when you listen to it on a hydrophone recording it and it's all kind of bubbling up and crackling around.
Oh, like pouring yourself a G&T on a Friday.
So it's a very refreshing sound.
Although it's not usually a good sign when you can hear ice melting in the ocean, I guess.
Indeed. And in
not quite as
fact,
joyful.
Yeah, there have been some groups who are looking at recording the sound, detecting the sound of glacier calving. So when bits of glaciers are breaking off, this is often detected using satellites. But when there's cloud cover, that's not such a great strategy. So there are groups looking at, can we detect these ice calving events, when these glaciers are melting using acoustics. No end to how useful acoustics can be.
Okay, so now we're going to listen to some biological sounds. I don't know what this is. Is this a dolphin?
It is a dolphin.
Is.
Correct.
Should we listen again? So cute. So let's listen to this one. Ooh. It sounds like the line at the beginning of a film. So, do you want to talk to us, Rose, about the two sounds we've just heard?
Yeah, so the first sound you heard was bottlenose dolphins, and I like to call this kind of the kissing sound. I think they were frolicking and playing around the boat when it was recorded.
Oh wow, okay.
And we know that that's that species because we could see them at the same time as recording. Because often dolphins can actually be quite tricky to tell apart if you don't have that visual observation as well. And then the second sound you heard was a Bruder's whale. This recording was done in New Zealand, and it's a moan we describe it as. So many of these sounds we use onomatopoeia to describe them. So different words that sound like what they sound like. Whales will maybe use these sounds to find mates, to communicate with one another, to indicate territorial displays, or for other unknown reasons to us.
So what they're doing and what they're saying can all be heard under the water.
Yeah, a lot of our role as scientists is to try and piece together the puzzle to figure out, because we don't truly understand what these animals are using their sounds for.
Oh wow. Listen to another one, I'm really enjoying this. It's a bit like the whale, like a grrr.
Yeah, so this was described as a growling sound, and it's being made by a red gurnard, a fish that lives on the seafloor. Again, we're not entirely sure what they're using it for.
We can see red gurnards in the UK. That's really exciting that we might hear something like that around the UK coast.
Yeah, there's lots of different fish species that we find in the UK that produce sounds. The other one is the cod, which produces a very similar sound to this.
So let's go a bit further afield and listen to this sound. This is so cool.
So it sounds a little bit like they're knocking on your door, trying to indicate that they're there. This is actually the popping sound of reef fish. This is thought to be used to keep schools of fish together, to keep their social cohesion amongst groups, because they're all talking to each other to maintain that they need to stay as one and move around the reef for protection against, those larger predators.
I have a bit of an out there question. So, when you walk past a bird in the garden and it kind of flies off and does an alarm call, do you think that is also reflected in fish?
Yeah, definitely, particularly on reefs and in kelp forests, those kind of areas, they really want to work as a community to be like, hey, all of you, there's something coming into the area, whether it's a shark or a larger predatory mammal.
Or a snorkeler. Someone else putting their head in the ocean to hear stuff. On to the next one. So I don't hear as much on this one. It sounds like when you're snorkeling, you can just hear stuff in the background, kind of going over rocks and just bubbling in the background. But you're going to tell me there's something in there that I can hear. What should I focus
so all
on?
that bubbling sound is actually snapping shrimp. So this is a sound that's found almost entirely around the entire globe, and it gets really, really loud, particularly around rocky reefs or kelp forests where they've got lots of places to hide.
So interesting.
But yeah, it's interesting. They're very small creatures, snapping shrimp, and they've got this one claw that's several times larger than the other one that they use for snapping and this kind of territorial behavior. About 20 years ago, there was this paper looking at how do they actually produce this snap, because for a long time they thought it was just, the sound of the pincers closing. But what's actually happening is that the pincers are creating this huge jet of water.
Wow, really?
And in the wake of that jet, there's this field of negative pressure. There's kind of positive pressure when it fires out, and then behind it, negative pressure. It actually opens up a bubble of steam. And when that bubble of steam collapses, it creates this snap. This is actually the same sound generation mechanism, if you like, that ships make noise from their propellers, which will come on later.
It's like a chewing.
That is exactly what you were hearing. You were hearing the opening and
There's
closing.
a little squirrel just there.
Yeah.
It's all recorded in
Nibbling on
background.
But yeah, you are quite literally hearing an urchin opening and closing its mouthparts on the rocks and grazing. And it's kind of similar. The action that's happening is called a Helmholtz resonator. And it's similar to something like if you get a milk bottle and it's half full of water and you blow over the top and it creates a sound. I think that's a good description.
Yeah, well, similarly to the milk bottle analogy, the amount of space that's inside affects the frequency. So larger urchins will create lower frequency sounds than smaller urchins. So in principle, you can look at the distribution of sizes of urchins that you have just by listening to these munching sounds that they're making.
That's amazing. What we would need to say is the Little Mermaid was wrong. The newt doesn't play the flute, the urchin does. Is that fair?
There's lots of players in the underwater orchestra. So really animals are using sound for everyday life, whether it's to find food, to find mates, to navigate their surroundings. So via the echolocation clicks of the dolphins that you heard at the very beginning.
Yeah, so this is a really, really important point, because I think for us as humans, we live in quite a visual world, use our sight basically for most of what we need to do. Underwater, that's very often not possible. You can perhaps only see a few meters. As we've heard, sound can travel for very long distances. And so many marine organisms have evolved to use sound really as their primary sense. So it's important to kind of bear that in mind. It's not just something that's a bit annoying like, your neighbour's music.
So it's not a secondary aspect of an animal's life, it's a primary. This is so fascinating. I'm really enjoying this. So let's listen to a few other different sounds, and we're going to now listen to something that we might not expect to hear. Oh, that was deafening. I don't think we need to listen to that again. So Nathan, what was that?
That was a ship of some kind. The sound of ships can be a lot like that. As we've been discussing, this is really a kind of sound that's been growing really since we began to mechanize ships in the 19th century. We think that shipping noise is probably the most prevalent, the most widespread source of human-generated noise in the ocean. So this is a lot of what these animals that we've just been listening to are hearing a lot of the time.
Let's move away from shipping noises. What other noises are put into the ocean by humans?
Well, yes, there are lots of them. We kind of classify noise as continuous or impulsive. Continuous noise is a type of noise emitted by shipping. We also get that kind of noise from dredging or drilling. There are also things that go bang in the ocean, explosions being one of them. But there are also seismic surveys, for example, which is technology used by the oil and gas industry and other industries that are interested in what lies beneath the seafloor. Clearly, if you are going offshore to drill for oil and gas, you want to know where it is, but these surveys are also used to monitor the status of those reserves and how depleted they are. So actually one of the major sources of underwater noise in UK waters is the seismic surveys from the oil and gas industry. So these are made using a seismic air gun, it's called. It's basically like a big metal piston that pushes out a big bubble of air, which makes this kind of low frequency kind of thumping sound, like doof, doof, doof. And these can go on for weeks or even months. These seismic air gun sounds are the major contributor to impulsive noise in UK waters, but there are also other sources. As our listeners are probably aware, offshore wind is a really important part of our decarbonisation of the energy sector. So lots of benefits in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. But the way that these are installed into the seabed is typically by percussive pile driving, which is basically taking a big hammer and whacking a big steel cylinder into the seabed to act as the foundation. And so that noise creates a big banging. It's more like a chku, chku, chku kind of sound. I'm doing my best here.
Who needs a hydrophone?
Yeah.
Listen to that again, shall we?
But imagine that, like, yes, many decibels louder. So that's one of the other sources of impulsive noise.
So, I mean, I found that pretty deafening. I mean, what is the impact on animals in the ocean when they have this increase of human-induced sound?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different impacts that we have to consider. The first of which is whether they might be deafened. It tends to be, well, you hope that many of these animals may elect to move away from the area and not stay in one particular site while a loud noise is being present. In the same way that if we were walking down the street and there's a construction site happening, we might decide to move away from all of that loud, noisy activity and walk on the other side of the road. However, of course, some animals don't have that option. Many of the invertebrate species are restricted, that they can't move away very quickly. But there's also fish and marine mammals who want to stay in the area because it's a particular spawning or nursery habitat for their young, or a key migration area as well. Like if you have been to a particularly loud club or a gig the night before, the next morning your ears might be ringing a little bit.
Yeah.
And that can be the case for a lot of these animals too. So they can suffer something called temporary hearing loss, where their kind of hearing is slightly damaged. It might recover over time, whether that's hours or days, but hopefully that hearing will recover back to full functionality. And for us as scientists, but also for the managers like protecting the oceans, we don't want it to get to that level where they are being potentially deafened, right? We want to minimize the risks to these animals. And so most of our focus often is placed on trying to stop, any behavioral impacts as well, because if you can stop those, then you're definitely going to hopefully stop some of the really extreme impacts as well.
And it's probably so hard to fully understand the impact. I mean, it's a great idea to just reduce the amount of human noise as much as we can to minimise the potential impacts that might be experienced by animals in the ocean, because it must be so hard to prove. It's not something that we're actively experimenting or testing. We're trying to just reduce our human noise.
It's a good point, because certainly in the history of this field, we've began by really focusing on the most obvious impacts of underwater noise. So, for example, in the 90s and 2000s, there was a lot of focus on Navy sonar activities which were causing mass strandings of cetaceans. So this is a very visual as well demonstration of the impact that underwater sound can have, leading to the deaths of cetacean species. But we actually think that lower level, less acute disturbances from noise might be more significant because they affect many more animals. But equally, it's less easy to measure those impacts, because we need to have good monitoring of those species and a good scientific understanding of how those mechanisms are relating to population scale changes.
What you're saying is the first point is understanding how noisy the ocean actually is and monitoring it over time. Why is that so important?
So another function of monitoring with the hydrophones that are used in various underwater environments is they can have different detectors built into them. So we have these things called click detectors, which will actually log clicks of harbour porpoises or different types of dolphins. And from that, you can get detections per hour or per day or per month. And that can kind of be added as a layer on top of maybe how much of the day we're picking up shipping noise. And so from that, you can begin to piece together the jigsaw of what might be happening between the two sides of the soundscape.
Sounds like a jigsaw puzzle with thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces to kind of piece together. I bet it's quite interesting to try and work out what's going on.
Yeah, we're definitely big data scientists. The amount of data we collect is very large volumes. And so now I think as technology improves, we're using AI, artificial intelligence. A lot of it you still have to kind of manually go through though. So a lot of the sounds that we heard earlier have only really been recorded a handful of times in different locations. And so you'll need an actual person to go through and manually find those sounds for a lot of cases until we can build those AI functions in the future.
Okay, so we've talked about so many things. We've talked about different types of noise. We've listened to some really awesome recordings. So we talked about all these impacts. What is the main aim for reducing underwater noise? We can't get rid of it completely. Some human activities are essential.
Well, actually, we had a big global experiment in this, of course, during the COVID pandemic, where there was much less activity in the ocean, particularly shipping activity took quite a dip in 2020. And so this was really a kind of unplanned experiment in what might happen if we reduced levels of noise in the ocean. As our listeners may have read themselves, there are many anecdotal studies showing animals returning to areas where they weren't previously. There are also measurements of underwater sound showing that the noise was indeed decreased. It shows that in principle, this is something that could be done. One of the important things to understand about underwater noise is that unlike other sources of pollution in the ocean, like microplastics or organic pollutants and so on, noise is something that if we take it out at source, then it's gone. It's not something that stays in the ocean for long. So it's one of these areas where we can probably have quite a big impact because it's going to reduce the overall human footprint on the oceans and help species and marine ecosystems to recover.
So how can we reduce it, and what are we wanting to achieve now and in the future?
There are different levels at which we can take action on underwater noise. Some things really need to be done globally. So shipping is a good example of this. Shipping is regulated by a United Nations agency called the International Maritime Organization. And they're now in the process of developing guidelines for reducing noise from shipping. Those are being further developed, and it's expected that these will become mandatory at some point in the future. So there are all sorts of things you can do to make ships quieter. Kind of relatively easy is to slow ships down. On the west coast of Canada, for example, ship slowdowns have been introduced to reduce noise in killer whale habitat, and that's been very successful. You can also manufacture ships that are quieter. You can do things like changing the propeller on ships that already exist. Good hull maintenance and so on will reduce noise from shipping as well. The main source of noise from shipping by far is what's called cavitation. This process which I mentioned with the snapping shrimp. So ship's propeller is putting a lot of force into the water, right, to push the ship along. That creates a kind of positive pressure against the water column. In the wake of that positive pressure, you get negative pressure. And in those negative pressure areas, bubbles of steam form. When those collapse, you get this kind of...
that we heard earlier.
That's probably going to be better than my impression. Yes.
Although we're enjoying them.
Companies are looking at the design of the propellers. Also, the shape of the rudder can have an effect. The design of the hull. There are also some quite interesting technologies, what are called air lubrication systems, which is a fancy term for putting bubbles underneath the hull. Bubbles are actually very effective both at absorbing and scattering sound.
So it's like soundproofing?
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
And in fact, bubbles are also used pile driving. Basically, what's called a bubble curtain on the seabed. And this is used as a kind of barrier to absorb and scatter the noise of the pile driving. So bubbles are very important in the world of producing ocean noise.
Bubbles are so important.
There's lots that can be done, these technologies, and there's really a lot of public interest, but also policymakers are really taking this issue quite seriously now. So there are lots of reasons for hope.
Brilliant. So it's time for our fun fact, and this is the feature of the episode where we have a fun fact or a nugget of information to take away with us. But today we're going to be having some fun sounds. So Nathan and Roz have provided me with a sound recording each, and I have never heard them before and I don't know what they are. We're all going to have a listen to them and see what we think they might be. Don your headphones again and let's listen to these fun sounds.
So you get to be a little bit like I am when I manually listen to my recordings and try and figure out what on earth I am listening to.
So Roz, your sound is up first.
I don't know what this one is either.
So guess for all of us. I mean, it sounds like a sneeze or something happening in someone's nose. You know when you've got a blocked nose and you're like... You know, I'm sorry about that. You probably heard that with your headphones on, and that's probably not nice to listen to. Not as good as Nathan's beatboxing from earlier. Elephant seal with a cold or something like that. Is it nowhere near?
Sorry,
look at the face.
Nowhere near. This is
what is it?
What we'd like to affectionately call the barking sound of a John Dory.
No, it's a fish.
It's a fish.
Okay, I'm going to confess, I thought it was a swan. You know that honking sound?
Yeah, like a honking.
honking.
Exactly. See, all the words we can use to describe these wonderful and weird sounds that we listen to.
Amazing. I'm
on a
so
daily basis.
Excited. I was a fish.
A fish
biologist.
The fish.
I'm a fish.
I'm a fish biologist at heart, so I had to play you a fish sound today.
Right, let's get on to Nathan's sound. It's a jungle bird. It's like a rainforest bird. It's a bird. It's not a bird underwater. It's a bird. Such a musical sound. What is it?
It's a good question. Do birds make sounds underwater?
That's a whole...
What
They
sounds
actually
penguins
do,
make?
yeah. So things like gannets
So I'm
or diving birds when
No,
they
you're
hit
not
the
right.
water sound like gunshots when they hit it.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a whole
Do
other
they do
separate thing, but
calls?
they're just like choo-chung, choo-chung.
So that's when they're kind of diving into the water.
When they're diving into the water.
It's not when they're not communicating.
No,
as
I
far
don't
as
think
we
they
know.
can like vocalize like the beautiful sounds that we hear in air underwater.
No. Do gannets sound beautiful in there?
Well, probably not,
A
but
bit more of a hiss. So it's not a tropical bird.
not a tropical bird.
What is it?
It is not tropical, it is polar, and it is a seal called a Weddell seal that live in Antarctica. So this is very unusual even for a seal sound. And it's thought that they have evolved to make these sounds in this way because of the kind of unique acoustic environment underneath ice. Weird sound.
It's weird.
Yeah.
I honestly thought there'd been a mix-up and it was a rainforest recording. It's incredible. Wow.
It's going to be in the next Star Wars movie or...
Set phasers to Weddell seal.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Well, I think it's a brilliant point to end this episode. It's been such a joy to listen to the sounds of the ocean today with you both, and I just want to thank you for your time and bringing these sounds to us for all of us to listen to on an audio podcast. You know, it's a match made in heaven, so thank you so much for your time.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed listening to the sounds of the ocean on our podcast today, you can find out more on the Discovery of Sounds in the Sea website or www.dosits.org, which has supplied some of the sounds we've played today on our episode. And yeah, this was just so fun, and really hope that everybody enjoys listening to the orchestra under the sea. Thank you for listening. This podcast was made by CFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. To keep up to date with us, follow us on social media using @CEFASGovUK. We hope you can join us again next time.